Our marriage wasn't perfect, but I thought it was strong enough to weather anything. Ariel and I had been together for 8 years, building a life that felt secure, even if it wasn't always exciting. We lived in a modest suburban home, the kind of place where everything felt familiar, sometimes to a fault. Ariel's mother, Linda, had always been a presence in our lives. She had opinions about everything, from how we decorated the house to where we spent our holidays. At first, I chalked it up to her being protective of her only daughter, but over time, her interference became a constant source of frustration. Linda wasn't shy about her disapproval of me. She never said it outright, but the looks she gave me and her pointed comments about ambition or providing the best for a family made her feelings clear. I worked as a middle school teacher, a job I loved, but one that Linda often belittled, suggesting Ariel could have done better. Ariel always brushed off her mother's remarks, saying Linda meant well and that it was just her way. I tried to believe that, but it was hard not to notice how much influence Linda seemed to have over Ariel. It started with small things, suggestions about how Ariel should dress or what events we should attend. Then came the larger gestures. Linda introduced Ariel to people she thought were good for networking, always framing it as an innocent way to expand our social circle. One of those people was Richard. Richard was everything I wasn't: tall, polished, and confident, with the kind of job title that impressed Linda, a financial consultant or something along those lines. He was a frequent guest at the gatherings Linda insisted we attend, and every time we saw him, she went out of her way to sing his praises. "He's just so driven," Linda would say, her tone carrying an edge of comparison that didn't go unnoticed. You could learn a lot from someone like Richard. I didn't think much of it at first. Richard was charming but seemed harmless, and Ariel never gave any indication that she saw him as anything more than an acquaintance. Still, the way Linda kept inserting him into conversations, suggesting he could help Ariel with her career aspirations, made me uneasy. As the months went on, I started noticing a shift in Ariel. She began mentioning Richard more often, recounting conversations they'd had at events or how he'd offered advice on something work-related. She framed it all as casual, but there was a lightness in her tone when she talked about him that wasn't there when she talked about me. I told myself I was imagining things. After all, Ariel had always been supportive of me, standing by my side through tough times. But the nagging feeling in my gut refused to go away. Then came the day Linda suggested Ariel work with Richard directly on a project for her job. "It's just professional," Linda said, brushing off my concerns when I hesitated. "Richard is brilliant, and he's offered to mentor her. You should be proud that Ariel has someone like him to guide her." I didn't say anything, but the unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that Linda's push for Ariel to spend time with Richard wasn't as innocent as she made it seem. That night, as Ariel and I sat on the couch watching TV, I glanced at her, wondering if she felt the same distance I did. She smiled at me, and for a moment, everything felt normal. But beneath that smile, I couldn't help but sense that something was shifting, something I wasn't sure I could stop. Linda's presence in our marriage wasn't overtly hostile. It was subtler than that, like the steady drip of water wearing away at stone. She always seemed to know how to frame her comments so that they sounded helpful on the surface, but left me feeling small. During family dinners, she had a habit of slipping in subtle jabs, often saying things like it was just casual advice. She would mention how a little extra effort at work could really pay off in the long run and suggest that maybe it was time for me to think about leveling up. I'd smile politely and nod, knowing she was just waiting for me to defend myself so she could pounce. Ariel usually laughed and said I was fine, but that rarely stopped Linda. Her interference wasn't limited to her critiques of me. She had an uncanny ability to insert herself into our plans, always with a tone that made it sound like she was doing us a favor. If Ariel and I wanted to spend a quiet weekend together, Linda would suddenly appear with tickets to an event she insisted we attend. If I planned a simple dinner at home, Linda would suggest an outing instead, inviting herself along more often than not. One Saturday, Linda called to invite us to a charity gala she was helping organize. It wasn't unusual for her to rope us into such events, but this one seemed to have an added layer of importance. She insisted over the phone to Ariel that it wasn't an event to miss. Richard would be there, she explained, and he was bringing some incredible contacts, a perfect networking opportunity. Ariel agreed without hesitation, and when she relayed the details to me, she seemed genuinely excited. She tried to reassure me, her eyes lighting up as she insisted it would be fun. She added that her mom was right. Richard knew so many people and had been really helpful with her work ideas lately. I forced a smile, swallowing my discomfort. The gala itself was everything I expected it to be, formal, crowded, and full of people I had no interest in impressing. Linda flitted around the room like she owned it, introducing Ariel to everyone she deemed important. I stayed back, nursing a glass of wine and watching as Ariel and Richard were brought together once again. From across the room, I saw Linda place a hand on Richard's arm as she guided him toward Ariel. Her smile was wide, almost triumphant, as she spoke to them, gesturing animatedly. Ariel laughed at something Richard said, her expression easy and open in a way that made my stomach churn. I joined the group after a while, making polite conversation and trying not to let my discomfort show. Linda was in her element, steering the conversation toward Richard's successes and how they could inspire Ariel in her career. Linda's voice carried that familiar mix of pride and pointedness as she remarked how Ariel had so much potential. She added how wonderful it was that someone like Richard could help her unlock it. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to smile and nod. As the evening wore on, Linda's praise for Richard grew more effusive, and it became harder to ignore the way she looked at him. It wasn't just admiration, it was approval, the kind that suggested she saw him as a better fit for Ariel than I ever could be. When we finally left the gala, Ariel was glowing. She chatted excitedly about the people she'd met and the opportunities Linda had mentioned, her enthusiasm filling the car as we drove home. I nodded along, but inside, the knot in my stomach tightened. Over the next few weeks, Linda's involvement became more direct. She encouraged Ariel to meet with Richard one-on-one to discuss her career goals, saying it was a golden opportunity she couldn't pass up. During one of her visits to our house, Linda emphasized her point, telling Ariel it would be foolish not to take the chance. She pointed out how generous Richard had been with his time and added that he genuinely believed in Ariel's potential. Ariel agreed, and before I knew it, she was scheduling lunches and phone calls with him. Linda acted like it was the most natural thing in the world, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was orchestrating something far more deliberate. One evening, as Linda sat in our living room sipping tea, she looked at me and remarked how I should be proud of Ariel, noting how she had really been blossoming lately. I nodded, biting back the words I wanted to say. Linda's smile lingered, her eyes flicking toward Ariel, who was in the kitchen. Richard's been such a positive influence on her, she added casually. Her tone was light, but her words felt heavy, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't lift. That night, as Ariel and I got ready for bed, I tried to push the thoughts away. She was my wife, and I wanted to trust her. But Linda's constant presence, her unwavering approval of Richard, and Ariel's growing excitement about their interactions gnawed at me in ways I couldn't ignore. Something was shifting, and I wasn't sure I was ready for what might come next. The subtle distance between Ariel and me became harder to ignore as the days went on. It wasn't a dramatic change, no arguments, no pointed words, but something had shifted. She seemed busier, her calendar filling with meetings and projects, many of which Linda enthusiastically encouraged. More often than not, these new endeavors involved Richard. One evening, Ariel mentioned she had planned to meet Richard for lunch to discuss a project she was working on. She spoke about it so casually, as though it were just another task on her to-do list. Yet, the mention of his name stirred something uneasy in me. I nodded and asked how the project was going, masking my discomfort. She gave a vague answer before retreating to another room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I found myself watching her more closely after that. I wasn't proud of it, but the unease Linda had sown was hard to ignore. Ariel would leave for these meetings with a noticeable energy, a brightness in her demeanor that felt foreign. When she returned, she often had stories about Richard's advice or how helpful he had been. Linda's influence hovered over it all. She visited regularly, her praise for Richard slipping seamlessly into conversations. She seemed determined to paint him as indispensable to Ariel's growth. One Saturday evening, Linda was at our house, sitting at the dining table with a cup of her usual herbal tea. She spoke about how much potential Ariel had, and how wonderful it was that Richard was helping her unlock it. Her words were layered with pride, but I could sense something deeper, a deliberate comparison that placed me at a disadvantage. I couldn't hold my tongue any longer. I pointed out that Linda seemed overly focused on Richard and his role in Ariel's life. Her response was calm and measured, insisting that she was only looking out for Ariel's best interests. There was no confrontation, no outright accusation, but her words left little room for doubt about her priorities. Ariel walked into the room just as the conversation was intensifying. Her eyes flicked between us, confusion and irritation mingling on her face. She quickly tried to defuse the tension, brushing off my concerns as unnecessary. Linda, meanwhile, remained composed. She suggested that change could be difficult for some people, a comment clearly aimed at me. Her tone was polite, almost soothing, but the intent behind her words felt pointed. Later that evening, Ariel avoided discussing the conversation entirely. She told me I was overthinking things, that Linda's intentions were harmless. But I couldn't shake the knot in my stomach. The following week, Ariel had another lunch with Richard, this time returning home later than expected. She explained that they'd lost track of time discussing her goals, her expression light and happy in a way that felt unfamiliar to me. I wanted to feel glad for her, to share in her excitement, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that her happiness wasn't something I was a part of anymore. Linda's involvement became more direct after that. She encouraged Ariel to spend more time with Richard, framing it as a professional necessity. One day, during another one of her visits, Linda casually remarked about how much Ariel had blossomed lately. The way she emphasized Richard's role in Ariel's life left no doubt about her intentions. Her comment stuck with me. It felt like Linda was deliberately trying to reshape Ariel's life, steering her toward a version that didn't include me. That night, as Ariel and I got ready for bed, I tried to push the thoughts away. She was my wife, and I wanted to trust her. But Linda's constant presence, her unwavering support of Richard, and Ariel's growing enthusiasm for their interactions gnawed at me in ways I couldn't ignore. When Linda visited again later that week, I pulled her aside under the guise of needing her help in the kitchen. I couldn't hold back anymore. I asked her what exactly she was hoping to accomplish by pushing Ariel toward Richard. Linda's response was calm, dismissing my concerns as baseless. She insisted that she wanted nothing more than to see Ariel succeed, framing her actions as nothing but support for her daughter's ambitions. But her words didn't sit right with me. The way she spoke, the subtle undertones of her comments, made it clear that she didn't see me as part of Ariel's future. After Linda left that evening, I felt the weight of her influence even more acutely. Ariel continued to spend time with Richard, their meetings growing more frequent. Linda's visits became less about casual chats and more about reinforcing her narrative. Through it all, the tension in our house grew thicker. Something was slipping away, and I wasn't sure I could stop it. The air in the house grew heavier with each passing day. Ariel and I moved through our routines as though nothing was wrong, but the silence between us was louder than any argument. When we spoke, it was surface level, brief updates, casual comments about dinner or her work. The warmth we once shared felt like it had been drained, leaving something hollow and unfamiliar in its place. Linda, of course, remained ever present. She visited frequently, often under the guise of helping Ariel with some task or offering her advice. But her influence was becoming harder to ignore. Every time she spoke about Richard, it felt like another wedge driven between me and my wife. One evening, Linda came over unannounced. She brought a bottle of wine and a stack of papers she claimed were resources for Ariel's career. As she handed them over, she mentioned that Richard had personally recommended a few of them. Her smile was calculated, her tone dripping with approval. Ariel seemed genuinely excited, flipping through the papers and thanking Linda for her efforts. I stood at the edge of the room, watching the exchange with a growing sense of unease. Later that night, I tried to bring it up to Ariel. I told her I felt like Linda was too involved, that her constant mentions of Richard weren't helpful. But Ariel dismissed my concerns with an exasperated sigh, saying I was reading too much into it. Ariel dismissed my concerns with an impatient tone, insisting that her mom was only trying to help. She pointed out how supportive Richard had been, adding that I should be glad she had people like them backing her. I didn't argue further, but her words lingered. A few days later, something happened that pushed the tension to a breaking point. Ariel had mentioned she'd be working late, and I decided to surprise her by dropping off dinner. It wasn't something I usually did, but part of me hoped it might remind her of what we had, that I was still here, still part of her life. When I arrived at her office, she wasn't there. One of her coworkers mentioned she had stepped out for a meeting, which didn't strike me as unusual, until I saw her car parked outside a nearby cafe. Through the large glass windows, I spotted her sitting at a table with Richard. They were leaning in close, their heads tilted toward each other as they spoke. Ariel laughed at something he said, her face lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in months. I stayed in the car, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I tried to process what I was seeing. It wasn't overtly inappropriate, just two people talking, but there was an ease between them that felt too familiar, too intimate. That night, I confronted Ariel. I told her I'd seen her with Richard, that their closeness was making me uncomfortable. She looked taken aback, then defensive, accusing me of spying on her. It was just a meeting, she insisted, her voice rising. You're blowing this out of proportion. The argument spiraled, our voices echoing through the house as years of unspoken frustrations came spilling out. She accused me of being jealous, of holding her back. I told her she was letting Linda manipulate her, that she was prioritizing Richard over our marriage. When Linda visited the next day, Ariel must have told her about the argument. She wasted no time confronting me, her tone sharper than ever. She accused me of stifling Ariel's ambitions, of being insecure and unable to handle a strong, driven woman. You don't see how much Ariel has grown, she said, her words cutting deep, and you're holding her back. The confrontation left me seething. For the first time, Linda's mask slipped entirely. Her disapproval of me wasn't subtle anymore. It was blatant. To make matters worse, she began planting new seeds of division. She told Ariel she deserved more support, someone who truly understood her potential. Her words were carefully chosen, but the message was clear. She believed Richard was a better match. The tension in the house was suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing Ariel piece by piece. The person I had built a life with was slipping away, and Linda was pulling the strings. But the final blow came one evening when I overheard a phone call between Ariel and Linda. She was in the kitchen, speaking quietly, but her words carried through the thin walls. Linda was urging Ariel to think about her future, to ask herself if I was the right partner for the life she wanted. I stood frozen, the weight of Linda's manipulation crashing over me. This wasn't just interference, it was sabotage. That night, I lay awake in the darkness, the realization settling over me like a storm. My marriage wasn't just strained. It was on the verge of collapse, and Linda wasn't going to stop until she'd torn it apart completely. Linda's influence shifted from subtle manipulation to deliberate interference in the days that followed. Her visits became more frequent, her conversations with Ariel more pointed. I could see it happening, the way Linda reinforced Richard's presence in Ariel's life, framing him as indispensable. One afternoon, I overheard her talking to Ariel in the living room. I stayed out of sight, leaning against the wall as their voices carried down the hallway. Linda was urging Ariel to take bigger steps in her career, emphasizing how Richard had the connections to make it happen. You deserve someone who truly sees your potential, she said, her tone heavy with implication. I clenched my fists, anger simmering beneath the surface. She wasn't even trying to hide her agenda anymore. Later that evening, Ariel mentioned she'd be meeting with Richard again, this time to attend a networking event he had invited her to. She explained it casually, like it was no big deal, but I could feel the growing distance between us in the way she spoke. As she got ready to leave, I told her I had plans to work late at the school. It wasn't a lie. I did have some grading to finish, but that wasn't the only reason I stayed out. After a few hours, I decided to drive by the venue where Ariel had said the event was being held. Part of me hoped I'd see her through the windows, mingling with others, proving my fears unfounded. But when I arrived, her car wasn't there. I felt a chill run down my spine. I drove around for a while, unsure of where to go or what to think. Then, on a hunch, I headed to a nearby hotel, the kind of upscale place Linda often mentioned Richard frequented for meetings. Sure enough, Ariel's car was parked in the lot. I sat in my own car, watching the entrance for what felt like hours, hoping for some explanation. Some way this wasn't what it seemed. But then, I saw them. Ariel and Richard walked out together, their heads close as they talked. She laughed, her hand brushing his arm in a way that made my stomach churn. They didn't notice me as they made their way into the hotel, disappearing through the revolving doors. I couldn't move. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly they ached, my heart pounding in my chest as the reality of what I was seeing settled over me. I told myself to leave, that I didn't need to see more. But something inside me refused to back down. I got out of the car, my movements stiff and deliberate, and followed them inside, keeping a safe distance. The lobby was quiet, the sound of my footsteps barely audible against the polished floors. Ariel and Richard were already stepping into an elevator, the doors closing before I could see which floor they were heading to. I stood there for a moment, torn between the urge to confront them and the fear of what I might find. The choice was made for me when the elevator dinged again, and another guest stepped out, leaving the doors open. I stepped inside, my pulse racing as I pressed the button for the top floor. When the doors opened, I found myself in a hallway lined with suites. The carpet muffled my footsteps as I walked slowly, scanning the doors for any sign of where they might have gone. Then, faintly, I heard laughter, Ariel's laughter, coming from one of the rooms. My chest tightened as I approached the door. Through the small gap where it hadn't been fully closed, I saw them. They were sitting on the edge of the bed, her hand resting on his thigh as he leaned in, their faces close enough to touch. I didn't need to see anything more. The anger I had been holding back surged to the surface, but instead of barging in, I turned and walked away. I couldn't confront them, not yet. Not with Linda's influence looming over everything. When I got back to my car, I sat in silence, the weight of what I had seen pressing down on me. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a carefully orchestrated effort, with Linda pulling the strings all along. That night, I didn't go home. I drove aimlessly, trying to figure out what to do, how to handle a situation that felt so far out of my control. One thing was clear. This wasn't just about Ariel and Richard anymore. Linda had made sure of that. After a sleepless night, I returned home the next morning, my thoughts consumed by everything I'd seen. Ariel was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee as though it were just another day. The sight of her so calm, so seemingly untouched by what I now knew, ignited a fire in me that I could no longer contain. I didn't give her a chance to ask what was wrong. The anger I had held back erupted as I laid out everything I had seen. The hotel, Richard, their closeness. It all spilled from me in a torrent. I couldn't hold back the words, each one weighted with the pain of betrayal. At first, Ariel acted as though I was mistaken, insisting that I had misunderstood. Her denial came quickly, her voice edged with indignation, as though I had wronged her by suggesting such a thing. But when I described the scene in detail, there was no escape for her. The shock on her face was unmistakable, yet she quickly pivoted, deflecting with excuses. She began to insist that it wasn't what it seemed, framing Richard as nothing more than a friend who had been helping her professionally. Her words were hollow, and the more she tried to justify, the more distant she seemed. I didn't hold back, pushing past her excuses to confront her with the truth she refused to acknowledge. I pointed out the lies, the growing distance, and the way her actions had torn apart the trust we had built. For a moment, she looked as though she might break, but instead, her defensiveness turned to anger. She accused me of not understanding her needs, of being too stuck in my ways to see her potential. Each accusation felt like another knife twisting in my chest, but I refused to let her rewrite the narrative. I made it clear that the choices she made were hers alone, that no amount of blame shifting could justify what had happened. And then I brought up Linda. Her reaction to the mention of her mother was immediate. She stiffened, her jaw tightening as though I had crossed some invisible line. But I didn't stop. I laid bare the years of manipulation, the subtle ways Linda had chipped away at our marriage. The tension escalated further when Linda arrived, unannounced as always. She walked in with her usual air of control, her gaze darting between us as she assessed the situation. She wasted no time inserting herself, turning her attention to me with thinly veiled disdain. Linda didn't deny her involvement, but she cloaked her words in the same false concern she always did. She spoke about Ariel's growth, about her potential, and how she deserved someone who could support that. Standing there, I realized that Linda's disapproval of me had never been subtle. It was deliberate, calculated, and now laid bare in the aftermath of Ariel's betrayal. Her words cut deep, but they also gave me clarity. As I looked at both of them, Ariel, still trying to defend the indefensible, and Linda, so certain of her righteousness, I felt a profound sense of detachment. It was as though I had been holding on to something that no longer existed, a life that had been systematically dismantled by the very people who should have protected it. I told them that I finally understood my place in this dynamic. For years, I had fought to belong, to prove my worth in a family that had never truly accepted me. But now, I saw the futility of it all. I wasn't part of this family. I was an outsider, someone they tolerated until they no longer saw a need for me. The words came out steadily, and with each one, I felt lighter. I told them I wouldn't stay where I wasn't wanted, that I deserved better than to be the third wheel in my own marriage. As I turned and walked out the door, the house behind me seemed smaller, less significant. For the first time, the weight I had carried for years began to lift, replaced by the faint but steady resolve to move forward on my own terms. As I walked out the door, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Ariel didn't call after me, didn't rush to stop me, didn't try to explain or plead. There was no sound of hurried footsteps, no emotion in her silence. She stayed where she was, unmoving, as though my departure was an inevitability she had long accepted. That, more than anything, confirmed what I already knew. Whatever bond we'd once shared had been broken long before I walked out that door. Linda's reaction, however, was anything but neutral. In my peripheral vision, I caught a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. She didn't bother to hide her satisfaction. This was exactly what she had orchestrated. A wedge driven so deep between Ariel and me that there was no repairing it. Her approval of the outcome was palpable, a silent victory in the war she'd waged against my presence in their family. The first thing I did after leaving was to call a lawyer. Filing for divorce wasn't a decision I made lightly, but it was a necessary one. There was no going back to a marriage built on lies, betrayal, and manipulation. The process was surprisingly straightforward. Ariel didn't contest the divorce. In fact, she barely participated. We divided what needed dividing, and I left the house to her. Through the legal process, I was awarded a portion of its value. Enough to start fresh somewhere else. It was a small consolation, but it felt like closure. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself in a modest but comfortable apartment across town. It wasn't much, but it was mine. A space free from the weight of a failing marriage and the constant presence of Linda's judgment. Ariel faded from my thoughts quicker than I expected. Her indifference during the divorce proceedings solidified my belief that I had made the right choice. Linda, on the other hand, lingered in my mind like a bitter aftertaste. She had succeeded in pulling the strings, but in doing so, she had created a future for Ariel that felt hollow, detached, and transactional. I began focusing on myself, rediscovering who I was outside of the roles I'd been forced into. Life became simpler, clearer, and lighter. At the end of it all, I realized something profound. Sometimes, the greatest strength comes from letting go. Of people, of expectations, and of the belief that we can fix what was never truly whole to begin with. For the first time in years, I felt free.